So we have people dialing in right now. Before we start the webinar proper, I'm displaying the antitrust policy notice as always. Today's webinar is very much about the OpenChain project itself and about what members of our ecosystem, user companies, have been asking for over the last months. We're now 9 months into the deployment of OpenChain as an ISO standard. And this has given us quite a lot of insight into where the global supply chain is at and where it needs to go next. You may have noticed that recently we've had a lot of conformance announcements, and we've had some new membership announcements as various companies come up to speed with the ISO standard. But of course, this is only one step towards the future of the supply chain. And we need to provide support and guidance to companies seeking to do other things in the context of process improvement. This webinar will cover two of those items. One that we have discussed before on our work team calls and refined, which is now ready for mass consumption. And then something new, which is going to be consuming a lot of our time throughout the rest of this year. Let's jump straight in and we'll have a look at how companies continually improve their compliance processes. Now, this is something that we went through earlier, and we had various approaches being discussed. For example, we discussed the possibility of having various levels of conformance. And this idea, while having some merit in regarding continual improvement, caused concern throughout the community that we don't want to be prescriptive. Various different sectors will have different ideas of how you evolve compliance programs and what that means. So to address that, we refined what we were suggesting, and here's where we are now. So first of all, the conformance community continues to expand and it continues to grow into completely new sectors. And that's great. That's led to this discussion itself. Our mission to raise the boats of the supply chain is well underway, and it is proving a success. We have had a lot of positive feedback regarding where the global supply chain is going. But when it comes to how does the supply chain evolve? What happens after people, for instance, adopt OpenChain, when they meet that standard? Well, that's where we have to look at supporting the community with case studies and other activities. The case studies that we can do will be non-prescriptive and designed to give insight rather than tell companies what to do. We're going to try and find a way that when companies have completed their OpenChain conformance, they can make a decision about what's next, what's our continual improvement. It's important to emphasize that OpenChain ISO 5230 is the gold standard for compliance. When companies have this in place, we know that they have the key requirements of a quality open source compliance program. The question next is really about evolution. How do we improve? What is the way that we can do that? Now, this type of thinking is originally very famous from Japan. Companies like Toyota have applied this for many decades. And it's a way of approaching the idea that we might be doing great today, but there's almost always a way to get additional efficiency or effectiveness. Now, there's many different approaches we can take. So this is the nuance that we had to touch and we had to deliver on. Company choices really depend on the company size, the company market, and other matters of their situation. So there's many paths to improvement, and we don't want to make anyone feel constrained as they do so. So because there's no universal solution, the case studies come in. OpenChain, as it did with education, can provide examples of evolution success. You may recall that when it came to our open source compliance training, we showed how very small programs can work and very large programs can work. And we made it clear there was a spectrum of success, and everyone doing things to suit their company and their market was succeeding. It's the same for continual improvement around compliance programs. Once you've reached the standard of OpenChain, it's all about refinement from there. So what we will do is have a series of case studies with real and hypothetical companies, showing what type of decisions could be made. Here is an example, Company X doing something very linear. This company is building more and more processes to have things more and more delineated and defined. For example, they start with OpenChain, then they introduce a software bill of materials like SPDX, then they introduce automation, and then they have audit processes where another part of the company or a third party audits the program. Companies don't have to do this to succeed, but it's an example of what a company could do if they felt this was useful. Digging into it a bit, when it comes to the very start, it's just about saying the OpenChain standard, the processes, it's working fine. We feel confident with where that's going. The second point of adding a software bill of materials is really about trying to make sure that your suppliers and your customer companies and internally, you all have the same way of describing the software. Again, this isn't mandatory, but it's a way to address this. Moving onwards, when it comes to automation tooling, you could use something like an open source tool like Fossology or ORT to check outbound software, to check that what you're sending onwards, it seems to have the licenses you expected. And then later you could add some extra processes like independent audits to double check that everything looks okay with a fresh pair of eyes. So the basic concept there is to give enough case studies and examples to help people apply this in the real world without feeling preached to, without feeling prescriptive, inspired. And one of the main things that was suggested is that we provide questions to help people think through what's appropriate. So for a company, will a software bill of materials make my supply chain easier? Will automation make me more effective? And is there a way to audit the efficiency of the program over time? And exactly the same questions could be given to a supplier. Again, these questions aren't mandatory, but they're examples of the type of things you can ask yourself to become more efficient. The outcome, of course, is that in each market segment, just as with, say, educational material, it's collaboration with peers that will ultimately provide the solution. So, for example, in automotive, let's say around Toyota suppliers or BMW suppliers, over time, a consensus of how programs can evolve together will build. And it can do it organically. We know that works. We've seen that happen with the ISO standard itself when it comes to the detail of processes people choose. So that's where we went. We started with the question, how do programs continually improve? We went on to the question of, well, should we perhaps have a way for companies to grade themselves, gold, silver, and so on? And we then heard from our community, no, that's not what we want. So we've landed on the idea that we provide the case studies, we provide the examples, and then each market segment, each company will decide what's appropriate. Okay, pausing there, I wanted to see if anyone has any questions or comments so far. Okay, so that's basically a summary of what we did in the work groups and what we ended up with. What you've seen now is what will go out to our global community later this week. So this is going to be the guidance for continual improvement around open source compliance. OpenChain is the key requirements of a quality open source compliance program. From there, you can iterate and improve your effectiveness and efficiency. That's that. And big thank you to everyone who helped with the editing process. I think we've got something very valuable here. As we've said a couple of times, now that we have the ISO standard, it's the next phase of helping to support the market in many ways. And people had questions about, what do I do with my compliance program? What's the future? Where do I go? This will help answer it. And I'm relying on you, the community, to also help build case studies here. All right, that ends the first part of the webinar. And now there's something new. And this is very important. OpenChain is going to have an automation case study running from September until December 2021. In some ways, this is not a surprise. For the last 9 months, we've been talking about how important automation is. And for the last 2.5 years, we've been holding meetings about open source automation. What is clear is that many companies find automation to be very useful for their compliance program. It is also clear that many companies want to use open source tools as part of this automation. The most common model is a company using proprietary tools and open source tools. For example, a company uses a proprietary scanning tool and also scans with open source tools, and then cross-checks to see if there are different answers. Some companies exclusively use open source tools. Some companies exclusively use proprietary tools. But the messaging from our community is that we need to do something a little better to help the supply chain as a whole. In particular, there's 2 things being asked for. 1, make open source tooling much easier to run. 2, make this open source tooling much easier to pass down the supply chain. Even if a company has absolutely no money and very little expertise, they should still be able to do automation if they want to. So our community has been asked, how can you help? And there is a game plan. Just like with the general thing of improvement of compliance programs, this is about raising all the boats in the ecosystem. People are telling us automation is important, and the question is, what do we do as a community to support that? Now, extensive automation being vital for the supply chain is a big thought. As you're probably familiar, setting up and using tools requires some expertise. And even if you're not dealing with the sticker price of proprietary tooling, you're dealing with the sticker price of time spent. So we have to think about how to make that easier to understand and easier to implement. We've actually done a lot of work in this area. In the last 2 years, we've done a huge amount of webinars, and quite a few webinars have touched on automation. On this screen, you can see a collection of 5 webinars that explicitly dealt with different parts, different types of automation. And of course, these webinars are easily available to you on our website. And these were important. They shone a light into different parts of where automation is at. They focused on open source automation, and they tried to introduce people to that solution that people were asking for. How can I use open source tools effectively and quickly? But showing people various single case studies is only the beginning. It's time to bring it all together, and this is where our most ambitious project to date, since we actually submitted our standard to ISO, comes in. How do we bring the tooling landscape together conclusively for everyone? Well, we have a plan. And this plan has been discussed over various months and different ideas. It's now solid, what's going to happen between September and December. It's going to be a multi-part case study. In other words, we're looking at automation as an overarching umbrella case study. And inside that, we're going to take a series of steps that will guide people to an endpoint where, if they choose, they'll understand the options really clearly, and they'll have really simple ways to use open source automation. In September, we're going to kick off with a new graphical tool from Facebook and TNG that makes open source tooling far easier to use. Our starting demo will show how this easy graphical user interface can call open source tooling like ORT, Open Source Review Toolkit, which in turn will call scan code to analyze packages. What we're going to show here is an example as close to turnkey as we can get, showing how you do a scan with a graphical interface, which will be as easy and as familiar as using a file explorer in Windows, Mac OS, or Linux. That's September 15th. September 22nd, we're going to have an interview released about how the graphical interface was designed. How is it designed to be as simple as possible, and also to address the idea of we want to call lots of different open source tools. We want people to be able to make choices. We want it to be effective, but understandable. And on the 29th, we'll have an interview about the internals of this tool, which is open source, about how the internals were decided. How do you delineate between calling another tool, using the API, ingesting its internal format or external format, and so on. So we're going to be setting context here of a potential solution for turnkey open source compliance tooling. And the basic solution is a graphical wrapper that can call tools in sequence automatically. October, we're moving into deep dives. First of all, we do a deep dive on how ORT works with this graphical tool and how the ORT internals work as well. The goal here is to make sure that people can understand on the graphical tool side what decisions were made for integration with a third-party tool. And then on the ORT side, to really understand what makes ORT tick. On the 27th, we're going to be doing the same with turn. It's going to be how does the tool call turn, how does it use turn, and what does turn do? What are the internals of turn precisely? For those who aren't familiar, Open Source Review Toolkit is basically used for code scanning in a pretty traditional sense, and turn is used for container scanning. So in October, the deep dives will give coverage to two of the major areas for open source compliance automation. Moving into November, we start to tie things together with complexity. So November 10th, we'll do a webinar all about how this tool works with Turn, ORT, and ScanOSS in the real world. In other words, how can you have a simple turnkey way to do your container scanning and your file scanning with multiple choices of open source scanning tool? On November 24th, we take this to the next level, where we have a fake supply chain with the suppliers running different tools. And we work on having software from the starting point to the end point with software additions described in SPDX to demonstrate how you can have different tooling in your supply chain and use the software bill of materials like SPDX to have a nice, clean, consistent output that matches the code. In other words, precisely the supply chain management we need to scale over time to thousands of companies. In December, we hit the real world. December 8th, Facebook will explain in detail how they're using this tool. December 16th, Open Compliance Summit, our yearly main event for the compliance and, well, quite frankly, the governance community. And we'll do a whole open source tooling ecosystem overview at that event to give people the final context. Here are the open source tools. Here's what they do today. Here's how you can use some of them really easily. And here's how we think some of them will be made really easy in the future. Now, you may have questions. I mentioned Turn, ORT, scan code, and ScanOSS. Will other automation be explored during this period? Other tools, because there are other open source compliance tools? The answer is yes, they will. For example, I plan to talk with the Fossology and Fosslight maintainers, as well as others, to insert them into the sequence of case studies and to explore the most transparent and easiest interoperability they can offer. The next question that comes up is, will software bill of materials be part of this? I already mentioned that we'll be doing a fake supply chain and we'll be using SPDX. So from the starting point to the end of the supply chain, including code insertions, SPDX can manage to identify the packages and the licenses and so on. So that's a strong yes. When it comes to SPDX, I mean, this is a choice based on our community. The community's expressed interest in how we can do software bill of materials using SPDX because a lot of them are using or assessing SPDX. Well, what we'll do is focus on how close is current automation to fully supporting the ingest and export of ISO 5962 SPDX, which was formally published around last week by ISO, and I think all of the press and so on will be in the next week or two. We're most interested in Appendix 8, SPDX Lite, which is a minimal subset of the SPDX standard that allows you to get a lot done. Basically, if the entire supply chain could support SPDX Lite, we would have a massive leap forward in where we can go. That means user companies deciding to use it, and it means open source tools supporting it, and it means proprietary tools supporting it. And we're already underway. So the question there we want to do is explore how close are we to being able to deploy this extremely broadly? And how close are we to being able to deploy it in a more modest way between smaller numbers of companies? When it comes to the modest way, we expect the answer to be very positive. When it comes to whole industry adoption, we expect the answer to be, we need roadmaps with some of the open source tools and proprietary tools for their complete support of SPDX Lite. All right, this slide deck will be put up so you can review it, share it, and so on. There are important links here to help give you context. If you don't know Open Source Review Toolkit, it's linked, ScanCode's linked, Turin's linked, Fossology, FOSSLite, and SPDX tools. These are various tools that allow you to scan and manage the code compliance. Some of them run on the command line, some of them have basic interfaces, and all of them will be of interest to you if you're assessing the ecosystem. Don't worry, you don't have to be an expert in any of these. We will guide you through it. And remember, one of our goals is to show how you can call Open Source Review Toolkit, ScanCode, Turin, and Fossology and FOSSLite and SPDX tools from one simple location or two simple locations in the future. When it comes to SPDX, SPDX can be found where I've linked it. You can find the ISO page for SPDX on the link, and also you can go direct to SPDX Lite to see the subset of the actual standard that we think may be most useful to get the industry started on long tail automation interoperability. So what about the Facebook TNG tool? That interface, that tool will be revealed on September 15th. So there will be an event on that day. It will be an OpenChain led event to kick off our case studies. And you will be all invited, of course, and it will be recorded and featured prominently on our website. The reason that we're doing it in a sequence starting September 15th is that we're actually going to be spacing our timeline, zooming up here to the timeline once more. We're going to be spacing our timeline to, after September especially, insert in between our biweekly tooling group meetings. So basically, every week from October to December, we'll either have a tooling group meeting where people can discuss things informally or a specific tooling webinar. All of this happens on Wednesdays. And by the end of it, we should have the most complete picture of the tooling ecosystem ever created. And we should also, as an output of our case studies, have the tools actually integrated better by the maintainers and the projects. We have commitments, for example, from TNG to work on making sure that as many permutations and support as necessary of this graphical user interface calling various tools will be ready in a turnkey manner. So it's going to be very significant. And there I pause. Does anyone have any questions about all of this at this juncture? Oh, hi, Fukuchi-san, how are you?
Hello, and thank you for explanation of your ideas, great ideas. And this is not just a direct idea, direct comment, but I have one thought on the OpenChain specification. And so the OpenChain's main target is the supply chain.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think it's a great, but OpenChain specification itself defines only internal open source program. And I feel something is lost regarding the supply chain. And that is why I started considering the SBOM and the SPDX Lite activity in Japan work group. And one solution is a SBOM. SBOM connects organizations in the supply chain. Yeah, and I agree. If you promote SBOM through OpenChain activities, it is very meaningful for me. And if OpenChain specification can describe interaction or interface between organizations, it is fine for me. And I don't know there is a solution or not, but that is my comment on your new activity.
It's a really good comment, Fukuchi-san. So I think there's two parts to the answer. The first part is that the OpenChain specification is designed at the very highest level to identify the processes which can allow the key requirements of an open source compliance program to exist. And Mark Giese and the team, early in the time of making it, decided to explain the very big picture, essentially the overview, and not the details. So for example, saying, have a way to identify software, instead of saying, use a scanner to identify a software bill of materials. So that flexibility was intentional. But it does mean we need to build a pyramid. At the top, you have the broad painting of here are the processes you need in general. And then when it comes to the detail of the processes, we have not put them inside the standard. We've tended to use case studies and examples. But we're gradually becoming more mature in the type of case studies and examples. For example, we recently did a document, a guidance document, regarding how to use this ISO standard OpenChain in security. And that document essentially contained remixed examples of the ISO standard and other guidance information. So, current thinking, it doesn't mean it's decided, but the current thinking is that we sort of have guidance extensions to the ISO standard. They don't change the ISO standard, but if you have a question like, how do I continually improve? What do I do next? There's a guidance. If you have questions like, if I'm doing automation around this standard, what do I do? There's guidance. So that's the general approach we have. The second point was that OpenChain has always relied on procurement as the main concept to link the companies. OpenChain only defines a program inside one company. What we're relying on is the supply chain to ask supplier companies to use OpenChain, so they all link together. So in this sense, the OpenChain standard also didn't explicitly say, multiple companies use this. deals with one company at a time with the intent that through procurement, we create the effective supply chain. But, ideas, suggestions of how we can improve this stuff, what we can do better, are most welcome. And for example, case studies around software bill of materials, case studies around automation, doesn't mean that's the end of the story. It just means we're filling out explanations in that area. And if there's other stuff we can do, hypothetically, if we said, okay, I want to use OpenChain in my supply chain, guide me, we could do a potentially an extension guidance document for that as well. So basically for Kuchi-san, our current status is OpenChain is designed, one, to be setting the big picture, but allowing the details to be painted by each individual company and market. And two, OpenChain currently depends on procurement for customer companies to ask supplier companies to adopt it. I hope that begins to answer your question.
Thank you. I don't need to answer directly, but I think this is just a starting point of a discussion, and so I want to continue discussion, and so that is fine. Thank you. Thank you for your answering. Trying to answer my bad questions.
It's a good question. And maybe the final answer we have today is that we need work groups to talk about what needs to be next. And that can be a debate. I mean, some people might say, oh, we should change the standard. And some people might strictly say, no, we stick only with case studies. We can have that debate. It's important. We're designed to support it. And I would love if the Japanese community, for example, could look at what we've talked about today. One is the continual improvement, which has now elegantly switched from grading companies into providing case study examples. And the second would be to have a look at where we're going with automation, concepts there, and do they help fill some answers? And does the relationship with SPDX make sense? So this is an open debate, and what you see here is meant to inspire people to go places next. By the way, I see Max from TNG has just joined. Hey, Max, everyone was just excited about the start of our case study program, September 15th. One question that came up from Ninoji-san at Toshiba was about, will the tool be available as open source? And the answer is, of course, yes. I just wanted to throw a question to you, Max, about what license will it be under and where shall we find it? I know the big reveal is on the 15th, but let's do a preview.
Yeah, I think we will choose a permissive license with not that many conflicts. And where it will be found, we will promote GitHub, the GitHub repositories at some point once we have settled on naming and all of that.
Excellent. So in short answer, it should be as accessible as every other open source tool. And I'm pretty excited. The main thing people have said to us, apart from saying that they're putting OpenChain into procurement, is their suppliers need automation, and automation is too hard. So what we're going to be doing with automation and software bill of materials for the next 4 months has the potential to transform the landscape in a practical manner. Companies are waiting for this. And while OpenChain is not in the business of making software or releasing software, our case study is a framework for new software to come out and get context, and for existing software to get context. There, I pause and end with the note that these slides will be available just after this call. I'm going to work on transcoding and having the call up in the next few hours, and the slides will be on SlideShare for you to look at and download. Does anyone have any further questions at this point? Ninuchi-san.
Hi, Shane and Maximilian. So thank you for your information. So first, so I and the Toshiba is working for the complex automation. So we are very excited to hear of you, and we are really interested in TNG. So we are very looking forward to your available the software. So, and by the way, so I have one thing to ask you, especially Shane. So today, sorry. So otherwise, I'm sorry. I joined this session a little bit later. So because I missed the point, but it's a discussion of the complex automation. So it is not limited to the tool with TNG, right? So
Right.
oh, okay. So because I asked you like this is so now our Toshiba currently working with the SW360 and the Fossology and also scan code. So
Yes. Really, what
I'm a
we're
little
looking
bit conscious about it. So what is going on?
what we have done in the past with looking at the different tools has been shining a light on solutions. And people have found that useful. But the main feedback we got from people was, it's not carrying me from starting through to complex solutions. So what we're going to be doing is tying stuff up, bringing it together using a very large case study, which has multiple parts. And the idea is not to suggest that this is the only way, but the idea is to suggest, here's a really good example of how you can pull things together. So for example, how can this graphical user interface call ORT calling scan code to get a solution? And this goes on and on through the case study with Turn as well, and then later Scan OSS. So it's all about illustrations, but it's not intended to say you must use the PNG tool. It's saying, here's what this thing can do to bring stuff together, because people are saying, how do I bring it together? And to be honest, one thing I hope to do, and I hope to work with projects like Fossology and Fosslite, is to also have their case studies of bringing things together. Interoperability, tool-to-tool calling, the whole deal. So what we're doing is illustrating in a multiple part how you make it super easy to use open source tools. But exactly. I don't just want to promote this, I want to promote what you're doing too. And I'd love if we can make our schedule include more solutions at the same time.
Okay. I deeply sympathize with you, Shane. Simple going is good, so good.
Well, what would be great is ultimately, if we can say that you can use a software bill of materials like SPDX, you can use something very minimal like SPDX Lite in lots of simple ways. So as we tie things together, honestly, the main glue is that every tool should interoperate with information perfectly. And if our case study has one outcome, I hope it's showing how certain tools can do that today and inspiring other tools to do it tomorrow, so that eventually suppliers can find lots of simple solutions, and it doesn't matter what they're using. They can send the right information to you.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Really good question, though. Yeah, it's so much about just tying things together because we spent a lot of time showing people stuff, but we haven't created one story to inspire people, and this is the one story. But if we can do additional case studies, additional illustrations with you and with others, I would love that. That's going to help so much. So please talk to your team about it.
Okay, I wait.
All right, everyone. One last chance for additional questions. And if not, we're going to end this webinar here. I'm going to release the webinar later today. And we're going to begin our biggest ever case study to try to make tooling less mysterious to try to make software bill of materials really easy. This is going to be a lot of work for me and Max, but it's worth it. It's definitely worth it. I just noticed we have Helio joining. Helio, good news and bad news. It's been an awesome webinar, but we're finishing early.
Yeah. Yes, you're having solving work problems. Sorry for that. Yeah.
Well, the recording of this webinar will be up today. So in a few hours, you'll have the recording.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. Thank you. Have a great day, and I will talk with you all very soon. Be well.